So for this first video, we'll be working on the base sub-assembly. We'll be tweaking the y-axis to make it as perfect as possible. We'll be adding the vertical extrusions for our frame. We'll be adding on the PSU, known as a power supply unit, and we'll be tacking on the screen to the very front. Our first step is going to be grabbing our largest Allen key, and we're going to be messing around with the legs of our base. A lot of people from the manufacturer say that these are twisted ever so slightly, and so without doing any modifications, the printer right out of the box starts to wobble, which can then put a lot of changes and not great surface quality into their prints. So we'll take our large Allen key, and we'll be loosening the 2 bolts on each side, which will then relieve all of the stress. And we'll do that on the other side as well. And really press down and try and work out all of those really small twists and tensions that you get in this. Then we can fully tighten it up, not too tight, and our base should be much better because of it. If you do have access to a machine shop, or you know someone that has a machine shop, then you may find something called a granite block inside. A granite block is usually the flattest surface that you'll come across in a manufacturing environment. It's where a lot of really high precision, sometimes less than 1/1000th of an inch, things are calibrated and measured. Next, we'll grab our double-sided wrench. Well, it kind of wobbles a little bit. And anytime you've got this huge machine that's got all of these different things that can basically put in error, all that error just magnifies and magnifies, and you run into a ton of issues, and fixing one of them just won't help. So underneath this, after flipping it over, you'll see that we have got 4 wheels. These wheels, 2 of them are normal and 2 of them are known as eccentric wheels, where the very center of the axle of the bearing and the very center axle of the nut that's holding it together aren't actually perfectly centered. They're off a little bit, known as eccentricism. So by tightening or loosening that nut, just by turning it, we can actually minutely move the wheel one way to put more pressure onto the frame or make it looser. Right now, our wheels are just barely too far away from our frame. So by turning the wheels just a little bit, we can actually make our frame much more stable. We don't want to put so much pressure that we're now putting stress on the motor, but we also don't want it too loose that it starts to kind of twitch a little bit. So we'll be grabbing our double-sided wrench and putting it underneath and just testing. What I'm looking for is that you should be able to spin a wheel and it should track on the frame perfectly. If you see this front wheel on me, I can twist it and twist it and twist it, and it still does not track down the frame. So I'm just going to spin that eccentric nut. Now there is no righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. You just have to turn one way, test it. If it becomes looser, go the other way. And there we go. With just a little bit of work, our frame now moves nice and smoothly, and we don't have any wobble in our frame whatsoever. Now that we have our base nice and fixed, we're going to be adding on our vertical frames. Now they may look very, very similar, but they're actually ever so slightly different. What I want you guys to do is take a look at the 20 by 40 aluminum extrusion. That's the rectangular one. These are going to be our verticals. So this is the very front of the printer, this big black box. This is where you're going to be putting in your SD card. This is where your motherboard is. So on your left-hand side, you have got this aluminum extrusion with the 2 holes right at the very, very bottom. This can go either way, doesn't matter. You just want to make sure both the holes are at the very bottom. The right-hand aluminum extrusion is ever so slightly different. It has 2 vertical holes, and you want the 2 holes to be on the inside and on the bottom. It's really easy to accidentally flip this so the 2 holes are at the very top, and unfortunately the cables just won't reach, and you'll have to take everything apart just to rotate this. So please, before you start to tighten anything down too tight, double check everything is in the right orientation. We'll be tightening everything by using the M5 by 45 bolts. These should be the largest and longest bolts you have. And these are going to go through the underside into the aluminum threads on the very end of our extrusion. What we have with these steel threads going into the aluminum threads is a bit of an issue. If we use the very short stem of the Allen key and tighten down just too much, well then we'll actually strip all of the threads in our aluminum frame. So a much better idea is to just use the long stem. So throughout this assembly, I'll be denoting when we have a steel bolt going into a steel nut, and that's when you can use the short stem of your Allen key. But for everything else, just tighten as tight as you can go with the long stem. We'll be passing these bolts and screwing it into the very bottom. This first vertical is always the tricky one. So we just want to screw these in a little bit. They don't need to be all the way tightened because we're going to be using something known as a square to make everything as perfect as we can get it. So we actually just want to have the two bolts proud of the surface just by about 1 millimeter. And that way our frame can still wobble just a little bit. And we'll do a similar thing on the other side. So right now we've got two verticals that are good and wobbly. So now we're going to introduce something known as a square. The square, even though it usually looks like a triangle, is a very simple tool that has a 90-degree angle that we can actually clamp in between our two frames and then tighten it down once everything is nice and secure. We don't really care if our two verticals are leaning in a little bit too much or leaning a little bit away from each other, because as soon as we put the top frame on it, it'll square everything up just fine. So it isn't necessary to have a square and some clamps with you, but during this assembly, it is that little bit nice to have on hand. So we'll be taking what's known as a framing square and clamping it to our frame. As soon as everything is nice and secure, then we can fully tighten everything with our Allen key. Now that we have our two clamps in place, we can now take our Allen key and tighten it. All right. That's good and tight. Now we'll just do the other side. So now we'll be putting the PSU, our power supply unit, on this back side over here. What I want you guys to notice before we attach anything is that on the very back side, you'll notice there's a little red switch on there. And they usually set to 230 volts for countries that use 220, mainly certain parts of Asia and Europe. But here in the US, we use 110 voltage. So we're actually going to use a small screwdriver and flick this so it says 115. So now we'll spin this around, and our PSU is going to have our two bolts that are the M4 by 20 variety, and they're going to go through the front and attach into the back. One thing that you should note is that the very bottom of the PSU does not rest on the frame. It's actually elevated just a little bit. So it may be a little tricky to line up the screws right at the very beginning, but it's not too bad. And remember, because we are going from a steel bolt into a aluminum thread, you don't want to tighten it with the short stem, just the long stem. And this isn't really a load-bearing component, so there is no need to keep it extremely tight. As long as you can get it kind of snug, that'll be just fine. So now that we're at the back of our machine, we've got our red and black cables coming out of our PSU and the red and black cables going into our motherboard. There's only one way they can go together, so just grab them, push them into place, and the PSU is all done. Now we can spin our machine around and start to go into the screen. So now we have the front of the machine, and this is where we're going to be attaching our screen with the rainbow cable to the very front right-hand side of our frame. You can take the plastic off, put it up to the mic. Lovely. And we can attach the rainbow cable to the very back side. Now notice that there's 3 connectors over here, and we're going to attach it into EXP3, the very right-hand side. So this simply plugs in the front, and then we'll add the 2 screws that go to the very front. So with our base assembly done, next we'll move on to the X-axis.